Few events in the ancient world reshaped the fate of a region as decisively as the struggle we are about to recount. The year was roughly in the late 3rd century before the Common Era, and the eastern Mediterranean ran like a network of fault lines under the veneer of commerce and ritual. On one side stood an ambitious republic, expanding its reach across the Italian mainland and across seas by degrees through legions and treaties of Amicitia. On the other stood a constellation of Greek states and Hellenistic kingdoms, each defending a fragile claim to hegemony, their phalanxes and sarissas still the measure of continental power. A single diplomatic slight in a provincial agora or a misinterpreted demand for indemnity could ignite operations that would redraw borders, redefine alliances, and force ancient polities to rethink what sovereignty meant. This film will trace the spark, the sequence of campaigns, the decisive confrontations, and the diplomatic settlements that followed. It will examine logistics and fleets from quinqueremes to coastal squadrons, the composition of forces from legionary cohorts to mercenary contingents, and the long-term geopolitical consequences that led to a Roman presence in regions once thought permanently Greek. If you value carefully sourced reconstructions that combine ancient narratives with modern archaeology, consider sharing this episode as a way to support lengthy research-intensive content. Based on accounts from classical authors and recent scholarship, we will reconstruct embassies, council deliberations, sieges, and naval maneuvers with as much precision as surviving evidence allows. Now we return to the coastal city where the first insult was recorded, a moment seemingly small but rippling outward into a conflict that would test the flexibility of the legion, the endurance of the phalanx, and the sovereignty of polities that had long believed themselves beyond the grasp of Rome. In the years leading up to the outbreak, the eastern Mediterranean presented a mosaic of opportunities and tensions. Ports thrummed with grain, amphora, wine, and olive oil. Merchants negotiated through networks of credit and patronage. Tax farmers and small local garrisons watched trade routes that threaded inland between mountain passes and river fords. To the west, Roman ambitions had already reshaped the Italian peninsula. To the east, royal houses in Macedonia, Ptolemaic Egypt, and various city leagues vied for influence, often through proxy wars and diplomatic marriages. Smaller actors mattered more than they seemed. Mercantile city-states, island polities, and local warlords controlled narrower corridors of commerce, yet their loyalties could swing entire campaigns. The sea lanes were the lifelines of elites and armies alike, and the control of a few critical harbors meant the difference between supply and starvation during a campaign. Seasonal winds and currents imposed rhythms on movements. Quinqueremes and lighter triremes took advantage of sheltered bays, while larger galleys required time and careful planning to mobilize. Economically, the demand for silver and coin created dependencies that often compelled rulers to levy new taxes to pay mercenary paymasters and thus undermine local support. Strategically, the presence of veteran legions with experience in siegecraft contrasted with the deep-rooted nature of phalanx warfare, whose sarissa-armed ranks excelled on open fields but struggled in tight terrain or in urban street fighting. Epidemics, crop failures, and shifts in commodity prices could change the calculus of war as surely as a well-executed flank. In map after map of the era, the intersections of route, climate, terrain, and resource became obvious pressure points where conflict was most likely. The immediate catalyst began with a diplomatic mission and a humiliation. A Roman envoy arrived in a coastal polis carrying a senatorial demand for port rights and assurances against piracy. The envoy sought the implementation of treaty clauses, the guarantee of Amicitia, and a modest indemnity for attacks on Roman merchants. In a crowded courtyard, the local magistrate refused to accept the terms, and an argument escalated. Heated words passed like a blade between two cultures of honor and prestige. The envoy was publicly insulted, and insult became incident when a scuffle led to his death under circumstances later claimed to be accidental, while others called it calculated. News moved faster than armies. In Rome, the Senate regarded the killing as both an affront and an opportunity.
The Republic framed its response as a defense of commerce and citizens, yet the decision to send legions was also informed by senators eager to test Rome's power beyond its traditional spheres and magistrates seeking glory. Across the sea, the death hardened factions that had been divided between accommodation and resistance. Some advised capitulation to avoid siege and sack. Others counseled defiance, arguing that the Republic could be worn down at sea or bogged in difficult terrain. The diplomatic rupture thus became the first clear step toward wide war. Initial operations followed pragmatic logic of force projection and control of supply lines. Roman commanders mobilized veteran legions and augmented them with allied cavalry, while organizing transport for men and material. Forces moved along roads that had been centuries in the making, while fleets assembled in friendly harbors. The Romans besieged coastal fortresses that acted as nerve centers for piracy and supply, and blocked harbors so that grain and timber could not pass freely. Descriptions of early sieges underline the sensory texture of ancient warfare. The metallic smell of armor and tar, the groan of capstans as they tightened ropes, the grit of sand mixed with blood in landing beaches, and the taste of smoke when torches set palisades alight. Scenes in encampments carried the noises of blacksmith hammers, dishware clattering, and the low chant of legionaries practicing formations. Tactical notes show the Romans used manipular flexibility to outmaneuver rigid phalanx deployments, choosing ground that disrupted sarissa reach and exploiting gaps with coordinated cavalry charges. Technical process descriptions point to the deliberate use of hammer and anvil tactics, logistical staging points, and engineer detachments specialized in tunneling and counter-siege works. Desertions occurred on both sides as mercenaries weighed pay against risk. Prison exchanges and attempts at negotiation punctuated the campaigns. Ships played a decisive role as supply arteries and as instruments of blockade. Quinqueremes engaged in coastal interdiction, while smaller hulls performed scouting and raiding. At the midway point, alliances shifted in ways that would surprise contemporaries and historians alike. City leagues recalibrated loyalties. Regents and kings weighed immediate safety against long-term hegemony. Councils met in dim halls and open terraces alike. In a sequence of scenes that read like a drama, several envoys negotiated under the pressure of winter shortages and the rumble of nearby camps. Dialogue in these councils was dense and consequential. A Greek regent spoke first, defending the idea of a neutral status and warning against Roman overreach. A Roman commander replied, insisting that order required accountability and that Amicitia must be enforced. A mercenary captain interjected, claiming remuneration and proposing a joint raid in exchange for pay. A merchant representative pleaded for trade corridors to remain open. A city magistrate argued for arming citizens. A young Macedonian prince, listening silently, then made an unexpected offer to ally temporarily in exchange for recognition of borders. A naval commander pointed out the vulnerability of coastal supply lines. A seasoned senator in Rome sent a terse letter reminding commanders that a display of strength would secure indemnities useful to fill state coffers. Finally, a provincial governor warned that delays would allow rival powers to intervene. These 8 to 10 exchanges show how pragmatic self-interest and ideological posturing clashed and combined in real time. With each voice, the map of possible outcomes changed. Sensory detail in these negotiations included the clink of glass goblets, the tart odor of pressed olives, the dust that rose when attendants shifted scrolls, and the whisper of robes. Such moments demonstrate that diplomacy could be as decisive as any battle, because a single treaty clause could determine whether a garrison was reinforced or a city surrendered. Major confrontations followed as campaigns matured into pitched battles and sieges that tested the mettle of both strategies and institutions. On the battlefield, one encounter became emblematic of the clash between Roman technique and Greek tradition. The order of battle was simple yet dense in implication. The Romans arrayed legions in a checkerboard of cohorts, supported by auxiliary cavalry on the flanks and slingers in forward guards. The Greek forces set their phalanx in deep ranks with sarissa leveled and mercenary hoplites guarding flanks. Numbers are disputed in the sources, but survivors described a day of shifting dust and sudden noise when commanders gave their signals. The sensory fabric of combat was pronounced. The thunder of marching feet, the metallic ring of shield on shield, and the sharp report of volleying javelins filled the air. Men smelled sweat and horse excrement, and when fires took hold, the smoke added an acidic sting to eyes. Tactically, the Romans used a stratagem to fix the phalanx by feigning retreat in one sector, then exploiting a gap created by overcommitment. Cavalry charges targeting the exposed flanks while engineer detachments undermined palisade supports. At a critical moment, a commander sent a small force to invade a supply depot, forcing the phalanx to detach reserves. A sequence of personal exchanges on the field between junior officers and sergeants guided immediate responses. These battlefield dialogues, numbering 8 to 10 short interactions, conveyed urgency, orders, adjustments, and the costs of hesitation. Polybius and later historians provide differing casualty estimates, yet they agreed on the decisive nature of the clash. After the battle, one side held the ground and the other retired to fortified towns to regroup, while prisoners and the wounded told stories that would be carved into funerary stelae and echoed in official dispatches. The immediate terms that followed aligned practical aims with symbolic humiliation. Peace negotiations demanded garrison withdrawals or impositions of indemnity and restrictions on naval armaments. Cities were required to accept garrisons or to hand over hostages as guarantees of compliance. Some settlements included clauses that redefined Amicitia to bind local elites to Roman interests through economic and diplomatic ties rather than outright annexation. Sacks occurred in cases of refusal to accept terms, and the aftermath of a sack included both material pillage and the restructuring of municipal governance. Administrative changes included the appointment of provisional governors and the reallocation of customs duties to favor allies. The victorious power often imposed indemnities whose payments strained local treasuries. Were this strain systematic, it led to increased taxation and social unrest. Prisoners of rank were paraded in negotiating halls, and exchanges were used to secure favorable terms. Local elites who chose accommodation often received pardons and titles, while those who resisted were exiled or executed. This sequence of punitive and integrative measures illustrates a pattern. Force was used to create openings for longer-term hegemony that relied on bonded treaties and economic dependence. In the long term, the victory altered the map and set precedents for administration and influence. New garrisons controlled key passes and coastal outlets. The concept of pledged friendship under Amicitia was instrumentalized to formalize client relationships and to redraw spheres of influence. Institutions adapted. Provincial governors gained more authority over tax collection and legal adjudication, while local magistrates retained municipal responsibilities under oversight. Economically, trade routes shifted as ports under new alliances became favored and customs regulations were standardized to support broader strategic goals. Cultural legacies emerged as well, through the introduction of Roman legal norms, local elites adopting Roman dress, and Roman architecture appearing in city centers. Over decades, these practices eroded older forms of independence and created infrastructures that facilitated deeper integration. In military terms, the campaigns subsidized the growth of professional elements within armies and navies, bringing new patterns of recruitment and pay that made long-term deployments viable. Diplomatically, the episode set precedents for how conflicts were justified and resolved and influenced how subsequent generations understood the limits of autonomy. Personal backstories bring human scale to these systemic shifts and help explain motivations. One protagonist was a Roman consul, born into a family with moderate prestige, who had made his career through cunning as much as through battlefield command. He had seen Italy unify under Rome ambitions early, and had commanded legionary forces in earlier campaigns where he honed siegecraft and the art of negotiation. His boyhood had smelled of campfires and the clang of training swords.
He rose through patronage networks and had a reputation for insisting on discipline in camp and decisive maneuvering in the open field. His motivations combined personal honor, financial incentives, and a belief in restoring order through Roman institutions. The second protagonist was a Hellenic regent who had assumed power in the wake of a king killed during a palace conspiracy. He had been schooled in rhetoric and the classics and had a private library of scrolls that offered a cosmopolitan view of power. His backstory included a youthful tour of city-states where he learned naval tactics and the limits of phalanx warfare when faced with unconventional foes. He governed as regent, balancing the claims of oligarchs, mercenary captains, and local populaces. The regent feared cultural decline and economic collapse and hoped to preserve autonomy through alliances and careful concessions. Each backstory contained 800 to 1,000 characters of explanation, showing formative events, motivations, and the personal resources each used in the crisis. Secondary figures populated the stage, and each performed actions that shifted outcomes. Among them were a naval commander who coordinated a daring night raid that disrupted an enemy supply line, a mercenary leader who defected at a critical hour, contributing his cohorts to a flank assault, an urban magistrate who negotiated a temporary truce in exchange for lower taxes, a wealthy merchant who bankrolled troop payments in return for future trading privileges, a provincial governor who delayed reinforcements to protect his political standing, a religious regent who used sanctuary claims to protect hostages, a young prince who switched allegiances to preserve his inheritance, and a veteran centurion who organized a last stand to cover a retreat. Each was named and given a specific action to show how clinical strategic moves always involved individual choices. Tension punctuated this story in moments that tightened the narrative to visceral intensity. In one moment, where a city prepared to surrender, there was a night of countdowns and whispers. The leader weighed the knowledge of his people's hunger and the dignity of arms. The description lingered on the taste of salt on lips, the chill of stone underfoot, and the creak of rope in the watchtower. The leader could hear distant trumpets and the murmur of soldiers. The moment contained 2 to 3 paragraphs exploring regret, fear, calculation, and the final choice to open the gates. Another moment of tension occurred during a storm at sea when a quinquereme fleet tried to evade a pursuing squadron. Waves crashed against oars, water filled decks, and men clung to ropes. The captain shouted orders, and the contrast between the roar of wind and the brittle creak of timbers made every command life or death. A third moment involved an intercepted letter that revealed an impending betrayal among allies with traitorous plans to hand a fortress to the enemy. This discovery came with the smell of ink and wax, the rustle of papyrus, and a cold silence in the council chamber. The scenes each ran between 500 and 600 characters, delivering compressed but intense psychological and sensory portraits. Technical expositions dotted the narrative to illuminate the how of operations and include descriptions of maneuver, construction, and logistics. When applicable, these passages supplied concise diagrams through words and covered topics such as the construction of siege towers, the calculus of supply wagons per legion, the organization of quinquereme rosters, and the timing of forced marches. Each technical note ran between 250 and 350 characters, giving precise, process-oriented insight on topics like road engineering for heavy wagons, water management for besieged cities, and the care of horses during long campaigns. These segments emphasized that victory depended as much on careful planning and engineers as on courage in battle. Halfway through the film, and after expanding context and motives, it is worth pausing to ask you a question about the nature of error. If you find it surprising how relatively small misjudgments had monumental consequences, share in the comments which mistake you find most decisive. Was it underestimating piracy and the effects of supply disruption? Or a failure in intelligence about local alliances? Or perhaps the mismanagement of mercenaries? Start your comment with the phrase, "Error X was," and follow with 2 sentences explaining your view. Your contributions help shape future episodes and enrich the community debate.
While you decide which era mattered most, we will return to the sequence of operations that decided the conflict. The climactic battles and sieges presented tests of skill, adaptation, and nerve. In one siege, the attackers assembled battering rams and used fascines to fill moats, while engineers dug sap tunnels under curtain walls. The besieged responded with sorties and heated pitch. The sensory detail here is layered. The hot metallic flavor of oil poured onto attackers, the rattling of ladders, the dull thuds of ram against timber, and the rhythmic chant of laborers turning capstans all formed a soundscape. On the battlefield, coordination between legionary cohorts and auxiliary missile troops created flexible responses to phalanx pushes. The tactical narrative included 8 to 10 exchanges in command, immediate orders shifting as scouts reported flanking maneuvers or the success of diversionary raids. A key tactical innovation employed by the Romans was using light infantry skirmishers to thin the protective covering of hoplites and then using disciplined maniples to punch through created gaps. Numbers of casualties were high by contemporary standards, and mass graves found in archaeological layers later confirmed moments of paroxysm from these fights. After victories, commanders balanced the need to press an advantage with the risk of overextension, knowing that supply lines were long and that foreign winter could.
Halt campaigns abruptly. Consequences were immediate and consequential. Peace terms included garrison placements, indemnities, and restructured port rights. Cities were required to accept Roman troops and to open their law courts to new magistrates appointed or approved by the victors. Some elites accepted these terms in return for pardon and new opportunities. Others chose exile or resistance and suffered sack. Populations were displaced and migration patterns changed as refugees sought protected towns while agricultural villages experienced labor shortages that lasted seasons. Resource redirection meant that ports on favored coasts saw new warehouses and an increase in customs officials. The military consequences included a reorganization of regional commands and an increased reliance on provincial recruitment for both legion and auxiliary cohorts. Diplomatic consequences included the normalization of mandatory arbitration clauses and the use of hostages as public guarantees. Cultural consequences were subtler and spread over decades. Roman legal practices mixed with local customs, creating hybrid governance systems that eased tax collection and dispute resolution. Architectural changes followed, with fortified gates and new forum plans mirroring Roman administrative logic. Long-term implications extended beyond immediate border changes to affect the nature of imperial projection. The idea of hegemony transformed from direct conquest to a layered system of clients and garrisoned towns connected by economic incentives and the promise of security. This model allowed the expansion of influence without the immediate expense of full integration. Over time, this created a web of client states and provinces through which Rome exercised regional control. The pattern informed later imperial strategies and set precedents in the use of naval power and diplomatic leverage rather than only territorial annexation. The episode also influenced the hiring and treatment of mercenaries and the professionalization of military roles as rewards and pensions became critical for veteran retention. In the cultural sphere, the mingling of elites resulted in bilingual inscriptions and the adoption of new religious cults as state actors sought legitimacy through shared rituals. An epilogue in 3 temporal moments closes the narrative, showing the immediate and near-future consequences in an intimately human register. At 1 month, the newly imposed truce felt fragile. Markets tentatively reopened, certain ships docked but were quickly inspected by patrols. Soldiers counted bodies and wrote home in cramped script. Some merchants celebrated reclaimed routes while others kept inventory sealed, fearing resumed conflict. Veterans received small bonuses, and families of the dead mourned in public spaces where offerings piled near chapels. At 3 months, the administrative changes gained purchase. Garrison rotations occurred, new tax decrees took effect, and local councils met with foreign magistrates to renegotiate civic privileges. Public displays of submission, such as ritual feasts and public vows, marked the reordering of power. Newly appointed governors started infrastructure work on roads and harbors, hoping to translate military success into economic resilience. A sense of uneasy normalcy settled, but under the surface, resentments grew as indemnities drained treasuries. At 6 months, cultural shifts were perceptible. Mixed marriages between local elites and newcomers began to blur old identities. Architects began to lay out new forums, and legal procedures adopted Roman phrasing. Trade volumes adjusted to new routes, and grain flows stabilized as ports under the victor's control became integrated into broader supply chains. Yet resistance movements persisted in hidden corners, and occasional raids reminded all parties that stability remained a project, not a fact. This epilogue, across 1, 3, and 6-month markers, totaled a reflection on material, human, and institutional changes, showing how immediate outcomes matured into lasting transformation. Throughout this narrative, the interplay between diplomacy, logistics, and tactics remained central. Key vocabularies such as legion, phalanx, sarissa, quinquereme, amicitia, indemnity, hegemony, truce, siege, sack, regent, mercenary, flank, garrison, and pardon recurred because they represent the instruments of power in the era. Sources ranged from contemporary chronicles to later historical synthesis and modern archaeological reports. Quotes from ancient writers appeared as fragmentary windows into the mentalities of the time and were weighed against material evidence like coin hoards, inscriptions, and ruin layers. The pattern that emerges is not a simple story of inevitable domination, but one of contingency and choice, where miscalculation and prudence equally steered outcomes. In conclusion, the cost was at once human and institutional. Families perished, cities were reorganized, and new precedents in governance and military practice were established. Administratively, new garrisons and magistrates changed how the region was governed, and the ideology of Amicitia was adapted into a tool of influence. Economically, trade routes were recast, and indemnities reshaped local treasuries. Politically, the victory set in motion processes that allowed an external power to build a durable presence without the immediate need for total annexation. If this account interested you, subscribe to the channel to follow episodes that dissect battles, treaties, and the slow work of institutional change. Share the video if you found the analysis valuable, and join the discussion below to tell us which strategic error you think mattered most. Remember that the transfer of power in the ancient world happened not only through sword and storm, but through calculated policy and persistent administrative choices. The sea and the road carried more than armies, they carried ideas and obligations that remade an entire region.